I have a friend who teaches entrepreneurial principles to kids. And the other day she went on a well-justified rant about what she calls the one thing fallacy. And it's this idea that there is the one thing you need to know to become rich, the one thing that will make you successful. And she's dead right. Those kinds of articles, those kinds of headlines really are clickbait of the first order. And thank goodness the reality of the thing is there is no such thing as the one thing that makes you rich. In both Poverty Proof and Is Your Thinking Keeping You Poor, I start off by saying, take a deep breath, relax, there are many paths to wealth, and thank goodness for that. There are, however, broad indicators of the kinds of behaviors, the kinds of things that you can do that will set you on the right track. Just for example, and quite surprisingly, maintaining a faithful family or remaining married and having children only within marriage is one of the leading indicators of an upward financial trajectory. And I think it's sinful that we don't tell people that. We don't tell them because we think it's politically incorrect or unkind and hurts feelings. But not getting that information out there is incredibly harmful. Now, you can look at these trends over time and ask logical, sensible questions like, what really does work? And you can ask that question on different levels. For example, if you're looking at a nation, some very big scale answers to that would be you need fairly low levels of regulation, which is to say you need the government getting out of the way of entrepreneurship and out of the way of businesses, but that has to be balanced against trust enforced by law. And what I mean by that is where there exist things like contracts, it is incredibly important that the nation upholds contracts. When that falls apart and people can't trust one another, corruption sets in and your country's on a downward trajectory. So there's a balancing act to be had there. You want a nation that gets its laws out of the way and frees up entrepreneurships, gets out of the way of the economy, but you want a high trust scenario. But that's at a national level. Let's talk about you, the individual. In my book Poverty Proof, I ask the question, who has escaped poverty and what did they do? I am immensely interested in the behaviors of human beings who have gone from extreme poverty to extreme wealth. And none have done so more than this group, and studying what that group did can be illuminating. Let's trace the wealth journey of one demographic group and ask, what did they do differently?
Who has escaped poverty, and how did they do it? At the dawn of the 20th century, while humanity was still inventing concepts like the automobile and the aeroplane, and at about the same time Jack boarded the Titanic to meet Rose, 3.5 million Jewish immigrants arrived on the shores of the United States. They were among the poorest of the poor, even by the standards of poor immigrants into the US. Most had come from Russia, a land that had just seen a failed industrial revolution and had an economy on the verge of collapse. And, worse, as an ethnic group, Jews were especial targets of extreme persecution. A few more came from equally troubled places like Poland, Ukraine, and Romania. Some arrived later, escaping from the Holocaust in Germany. Each early immigrant had an average of $9. This represented their entire worldly wealth. It was less than almost any other immigrant group. These groups did not have rich parents. They did not have systems or institutions that would help them once they arrived. And they did not have tools or infrastructure to take along with them. They were poverty-stricken in every sense. Yet 6 decades later, the mean family income of Jews was almost double the national average. Not double the average of other poor migrant groups, double the average of long-established Americans, who, at this point in world history, were considered the wealthiest people on earth. Jewish immigrants went from being the poorest of the poor to the richest of the rich. Today, just over 100 years later, they make up only 2% of the population of the US, yet they account for 1/4 of the 400 wealthiest Americans. More than 100 of the 400 billionaires on Forbes' list of the wealthiest people in America are Jews, and 6 of the 20 leading venture capital funds in the US belong to Jews, according to Forbes. And they don't just prosper in America. Everywhere they go, the Jewish people seem to out-prosper almost everyone else around them. If we truly want to understand the real differences between families that get caught in seemingly unending cycles of generational poverty and self-made millionaires, we can do no better than to study this demographic group. So, why do they prosper so disproportionately? What did they have? What did they take with them wherever they went that made such a difference? They didn't have vast reserves of natural resources such as oil. They didn't have cash. All they ever had was themselves. So, what was different about them? The answer is values. They took with them the way they were raised to think. It was never about external circumstances, good or bad. It was about the training within their own minds, which they handed down from generation to generation. That's why outside circumstances have been largely irrelevant to Jewish wealth. They prosper just about everywhere they go because they have always taken their way of thinking with them. And it goes back further than you might guess. In their award-winning book, The Chosen Few, How Education Shaped Jewish History, 70 AD to 1492, scholars Zvi Eckstein and Maristella Botticini point out that Jewish people have been among the wealthiest groups in any nation all through recorded history, from the time of their dispersion from Israel by the Romans in the 70s AD onwards. In fact, it is striking how often Jewish people were persecuted because they were the wealthiest people around. The reason for this is as remarkable as it is simple. There is one thing that Jewish people did, and still do, much more than any other people around them. They read. Jews read a lot, and they always have. In the 1st century AD, illiteracy was almost universal. That is, except for among Jews, where it was almost unheard of. It was a religious norm that every Jewish man was required to read and study the Torah, and also to send his young sons to school to learn to do the same. That one thing ensured that this people was unique on earth. Even today, the Jewish people read more than most, and the proof lies in their academic achievements. Of Nobel Prizes, 21.97% belong to people of Jewish descent. That's nearly 1/4 of all Nobel Prizes, and there are only 15 million Jewish people on Earth. So, mass Jewish literacy is one of the major keys here. Another is that Jewish people tend to be entrepreneurial. They favor starting their own businesses over options like going into public service. By contrast, Irish immigrants into the US tended to join the police force or other government institutions. Make no mistake, being your own boss is one of the greatest keys to wealth. He or she who owns the selling becomes rich. So, let's ask the awkward question. How do we fare on these scores, reading and entrepreneurship? In the Progress in International Reading Literacy study, which surveyed children from around the world, South Africa ranked last out of 50 countries. In research by the University of Pretoria, it was found that 8 out of 10 grade 4 pupils couldn't read at an appropriate level. Grade 4 is crucial because, in the first 3 grades, children are supposed to learn to read, and from grade 4 onwards, they are supposed to read to learn. 8 out of 10 children can't do it properly. That is the same as saying most. It shows us that, as a country and as a culture, unlike the Jewish people, we do not value reading. Almost as a rule of thumb, we do not teach our children to read. We should. Why does it matter so much? Reading is a shortcut to everything. Would you like to learn how to become wealthy? Read the experiences of those who have done it. Would you like to understand the history of the world and why you now live in a place and time that is the way it is? Read. Would you like to be prepared for the future, to help your children, or guide your multi-billion-dollar enterprise successfully into the next decade, or avoid the massive mistakes of the past? Socialism, anyone? It's killed over 100 million people via starvation or execution, and yet many of our youth today think it's a brilliant idea. Reading is always the answer. View it on a societal level, and it works too. Would you like to raise an entire civilization out of the Stone Age and into the computer age? Without reading, that could take millennia. Include reading, it can happen in a single generation, because the generation that can read can have all the answers that humanity took centuries to amass, all in one go. Not to read is simply to deny yourself all the smart cuts. And how about entrepreneurship? Even compared to the other African nations around us, we show a very low level of entrepreneurial activity. Most of our youth believe that entrepreneurship is too hard or basically not worth it. Contrast that with the number of studies that point to small and medium-sized businesses as the key to economic growth in our country, and you will see that we have a problem. And yet, as we will see, entrepreneurship need not be terribly complex. So now, let's take another step back. We began by saying that the great key to Jewish wealth is values. Two of the outcomes of those values were the habit of reading and a belief in entrepreneurship. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that values like reading only came about because of other values preceding them, such as love of family and religious observance. Without these things, Jewish parents wouldn't have placed so much emphasis on teaching their children to read. Here again, we see the importance of faithful families. I am convinced that you can trace this back to the simplest and most perfect concept of all: love. Because of their love of family and their devotion to their faith, they prioritized values like reading and raising their children to be entrepreneurial. That made all the difference. So, how did the ability to read actually make the Jewish people rich? Quite simply, their extensive reading meant that they knew more than most other people. This ensured that they could specialize in certain areas, even as other people remained basic laborers. They were able to start and run their own businesses, even as most other people simply sought employment. And where they were employed, they were better positioned for strategic roles, such as in management, because they knew more, again because of their reading. Reading made them, in every way, more capable and more valuable, which made them more wealthy. Good values lead directly out of poverty and into wealth via knowledge. In the simplest possible terms, to solve poverty, raise excellent human beings. They should work hard and they should be faithful to their families. What do you currently prioritize? Given all that, how often do you read? And realistically, can you afford not to increase the time you spend doing it? What are your thoughts on family? Are you planning to marry before having children? How hard do you work? Are you up to pushing yourself in order to improve your life? These beliefs and behaviors are the greatest determinants of your wealth potential.